If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. Glad you could join me today. I'm talk a lot about the three big enemies of focus and productivity. When I talk about them, they are interruption, multitasking, and distraction. I talk about them in that order because that's the easiest to deal with, moving to the hardest to deal with. But I'll be honest with you here, I'm faking that just a little bit. The actual biggest pushback I get is around multitasking. People defend their ability to do it. I say, interruption is a problem. And people go, yeah, interruption is a problem. And I say, distraction's a problem. And they go, what's distraction? And I say, internal calls on your attention. And they go, oh, yeah, that's a problem too. And then I say, well, multitasking is a problem. And they go, I'm a great multitasker. And then I have to say, well, no, you're not. It is actually fairly easy to deal with because it's a decision. So I define multitasking as not intentionally protecting your focus. In other words, trying to do two things at once. Here, I'm going to talk about what spurs that defensiveness, in my opinion. What is our drive to be multitaskers? What's our drive to attempt multitasking? And what is the evidence that we can actually do it? There's lots of scientific evidence that we can't do it. And perhaps people are just not aware of that. But when I tell that to an audience, they don't immediately go, oh, the science. Okay, well, I'll stop multitasking. They go, oh, the science is wrong. And then they'll give me illustrations and cases of times that they believe that they've multitasked or areas in which they feel like they're good at it. They're proving that they're good multitaskers. And so today I'm going to take on that anecdotal evidence. And again, the question is, what makes us believe we can do this? Or what incentivizes us to try to do it? Why would we think it's a good thing? So we'll look at different categories of these kinds of evidence that people are multitaskers. As a brief aside, I did publicly ask on LinkedIn, and nobody suggested any other categories than the ones I had listed. You may not know that I do that on LinkedIn every week. I put up a post to say, this is what I'm going to deal with in the upcoming episode at the end of this week. If you'd like to comment, or if you have a thought on something I should cover or a question, then you can let me know on LinkedIn. So if we're connected on LinkedIn, then you can start looking for those posts. I publish that on Tuesdays. I post there on Tuesdays. And if you're not connected to me, then please reach out and let's connect. And all you have to do is find me, Larry Tribble. That's not hard. And just shoot me a connection and say, hey, I listen to the podcast. And we'll connect up. And then you'll see these things and you can interact with me on the podcast and I'll answer your questions if I can. But all that's an aside. But I did ask, and nobody suggested any other categories beyond the ones I'm going to deal with here. In these categories, I'll show that they're not good evidence for multitasking. My big point, or one of my big points, is that we think we see multitasking. We think we're doing multitasking when we're actually not. And so it has to do with the definition of multitasking, but trying to do these things in these ways is probably not high productivity behavior anyway. We'll talk about all that. I'll consider motivations to multitask. What what are we trying to achieve when we multitask? And I'll consider some historical ideas of multitasking as well. And then at the end, we'll ask the question again, should we try to multitask? Spoiler alert, I will, of course, conclude that we can't and we shouldn't. I'll conclude that we should just admit that we're not multitaskers. I don't know why that needs to be admitted. I admit that I'm not 7 feet tall. We all admit that we can't defy gravity. But we'll take this tack on multitasking today. One of the big things that I think goes through people's minds when they think about multitasking is our modern computing environment. So this is one of a few different things I'll go through, but computers appear to multitask. And if you're looking at your computer while you're listening to me, you see all these different windows and things appear to be going on at the same time, and all that's great and wonderful. Along with that, there's a legend, if you will, there's this perception of the human brain or the human mind as a computer. And I think these two things combine in ways that lead us to say the computer's multitasking, so I should be able to do it too. And in order to address this, I want to talk about what a computer actually does. You may already know this. Computers don't actually multitask. That's a generalization. There are computers that multitask. They're presently quite expensive. And what they're actually doing is they have multiple brains. So multitasking computers are more like a team of people than they are like a single individual. Your computer that you're looking at right now probably has a general processor and a graphics processor. And what's happening is the general processor is delegating tasks to the graphics processor. But even the machines that can't, so that's an example of machines that can multitask. In the computing world, it's called multithreading. And it's very difficult, it's very expensive. We've gotten so good at making our computers switch tasks quickly that we haven't invested the time and effort required to make multitasking computers, multi-threaded computers, economically viable at the desktop level or at the laptop level, other than the graphics processing units, which are a special case. So our computers don't do it. Now, the way computers switch tasks rapidly is a couple of things. And I could go into detail here, but the history is kind of long and involved. When a computer task switches, it more or less completely forgets the previous task. It parks it somewhere where it doesn't have to think about it. Then, when it's time to get back to it, it effectively, near perfectly reproduces that previous state that it was in when it stopped. So a computer's running along on a task, it gets interrupted, it parks the state of the task very quickly and very faithfully and goes off and does the other thing we ask it to do. And then when we're done with that, it reloads the first thing. But it reloads it very faithfully and very quickly. So you compare a computer to a human being, first of all, human beings aren't multi-threaded. That's why we have teams. And that's why we delegate things out to different people so that we can have concurrent effort and concurrent focus on separate tasks. Humans don't completely forget the previous task. There's this notion called attention residue, which if we're doing something that we're heavily focused on and our attention gets jerked away, Psychiatrists, psychologists, neurobiologists are now thinking that there's some parts of our brain that take a while to switch over to the new task, that parts of our brain are still holding on to the old task. And that's this notion of attention residue. So we can't completely forget a task, at least not quickly. We can't effectively or anywhere near perfectly reload the interrupted state of the task. And this is where I take the example of dropping a book, and we have to go in and we have to find our place again. That's very much what happens when we try to reload the previous state that our brain was in. So we're not multi-threaded. Humans are not multi-threaded. We don't completely forget, and we can't effectively reload a stored state. And so when we try, all of this takes lots of time and it's error prone. And we've spent decades, the smartest engineering types in the world and computer scientists, by the way, programmer types, have spent decades trying to create a machine that task switches rapidly enough that it appears to be multitasking. So we look at the computers and we have this idea of our own mind as a computer, and we go, well, the computer does it, so we ought to do it. Well, the computer's not doing it either. And what the computer is doing, rapid task switching, is beyond the capacity of our brains. I think there's also, so that's one notion, but I think there's another notion, and I think we're still understanding the value of our own attention as it applies to the difficult kinds of knowledge work that we're doing in the modern society. The things that we need to do in order to produce value in the modern world are heavy mental tasks. The simple things are done. I used to teach my programming class, and I would say, as an illustration, that technology builds on itself. Technology doesn't usually have to rebuild what happened before, it just copies it and makes another one. And so technology builds on this. But our mental work is not that way in the same sense. We have these very difficult challenges. So, when I was talking about my programming students, I said, we've already developed the internet. You're welcome. You get on top of that and go from there. So in knowledge work, the valuable tasks are very hard, and they're very hard mentally. Now, most of our jobs involve some stuff that's fairly autonomous, that's not heavy mental lifting. And we all have some of that we do, but where we produce the highest value as humans is when we're effectively engaging our brains, at least in the modern economy. Historically speaking, people could be valuable as multi-purpose physical machines. In other words, we were employed in Henry Ford's automated factory because he couldn't yet design a machine to do the task that he wanted done, so he got a human to do it. And we're very good at that. We're very good at manipulating things and coming up with ways to move stuff around. And we have pretty fine dexterity and all these kinds of ideas. And so we make a outstanding multi-purpose robot. But the more that we have special purpose robots, the smaller the niche is for us to be good at what we do. So now we have robots that have finer touch than we do and better dexterity. They certainly have higher speed. They don't get sick, so they don't call out of work. All of that to say that the value that we provide in the world now is increasingly the value of using our brains. And the value of using your brain is directly proportional to your ability to pay attention. But historically, that wasn't true. And I think a lot of people are carrying that historical notion forward. I don't do work that's mentally demanding. Well, maybe not. But for most of us, at least part of the time, we are asked to do work that is mentally demanding, to come up with a new presentation, to think hard about a problem, to become problem solvers rather than repetitive doers. So I don't think we value our attention as much as we should. And another example is the amount of attention that I'm going to use the word fritter away. We devote a lot of our attention to our own entertainment. And I would argue that that's not economically valuable use of our scarcest resource. Don't hear me wrong. I'm not saying that you should be a slave to your work, and I'm not saying that there is never a time when you need to do something relatively mindless. But I do think our appetite for entertainment and amusement is probably overused. So all of that comes back to this notion of I'm not sure we understand and believe how important our attention is. And so we go, well, this task doesn't need my attention, so I'll do something else at the same time. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go along, but particularly your economic contribution, your most valuable work should involve your brain. Another issue when we think about multitasking is we engage in certain environments, in certain tasks. We have certain states of productivity where it seems we're multitasking. And I'll run through a few. And the basic point here is I don't think we're really multitasking when we do these things. And I'll talk about why that is. And if you want to view this as a refinement of multitasking, of the definition of multitasking, that's fine. So there are many things that we do where we could say we're doing two things at once, and we'll talk about several of those. If there are other categories that you think I've overlooked here, feel free to hit me up in the comments, and perhaps we'll revisit this subject later. My point here is to help you understand that there are tools that can help us be more effective in these specific areas. So a big category of times when people claim to be multitasking is when one of the processes, and we'll take the simple case of just doing two things at once rather than 14. But we appear to be multitasking when one of the processes we're engaged in, one of the tasks we're engaged in, is a task that we can ignore, but only for short periods of time. I use baking brownies a lot in this sense. So once you've stirred the brownies, put the brownies in the pan, and you put them in the oven, your attention is simply not required for some period of time. It's actually a relatively brief period of time, 15, 18 minutes. I'm not a great brownie chef, so I don't know. But there are many processes in our world that we start and stop, that we engage with periodically. And if you've got a good brownie recipe and you've got a timer, then once the brownies go in the oven, your mind can be a million miles away until the alarm goes off, the timer goes off, and then you better put your attention back on the brownies. But you can do anything while the brownies are in the oven. This has heavy overlap with delegation, by the way, which we do in teams and in organizations. But I would argue that if one of the two things you're doing is something you can ignore for big stretches of time, then you're not actually multitasking. We also engage in tasks that are easily interrupted and restarted. It's simple to pause the task and it's not costly to begin it again. There are probably several. The one that came to my mind is eating. So you're having a sandwich, you put the sandwich down. Now, some food is harder to put down than others. I'm a big fan of barbecued ribs. But in most cases, if you're sitting at a table, right, a table is largely designed to help you eat. But we do many things like this. For a while, I ironed my own shirts. And that's a task that's pretty easily stopped and restarted because it's not in a complex state. And there are others. And so if one of the tasks that you're doing is this really easily interrupted and restarted task, then it's simple to task switch. It's low cost to task switch. And that's really the argument I was making with the computer before. We have lowered the cost of computer task switching to the point where it's not really a cost anymore. So we can appear, the computers can appear to multitask. Another big category of things that people bring up to me is situations where one of the things that they're paying attention to is actually an active stakeholder that will let us know if there's a problem. Maybe pet care falls into this category. So, hey, I'm watching the dog. Well, unless the dog is doing something interesting, you're not actually watching the dog. The dog is there doing the dog thing. And if the dog needs to go outside, the dog will let you know. If the dog is hungry, the dog will let you know. And so there's a whole category of tasks. I think perhaps childcare often falls into this category. Are you listening for the child to start crying? Yes, you probably are, but it would be very difficult to ignore the child crying. And every once in a while, you go poke your head in there and go, yeah, the kid's okay. And then you come back and do what you were doing before. But that's an example of this active stakeholder. Customers are like this. They'll let us know if there's a problem. Now, the amount of attention we need to pay to them in between varies depending on your business model. I'll say another category of these environments where it seems that we're multitasking, but perhaps we're really not, is we all engage at some point in some mindless task. And by mindless, I mean our bodies have to be there, but our minds really don't. Mowing the grass is probably a good one. You're just walking along behind a mower for decent stretches of time, and then you get to the end of your row and you have to turn the mower, and that might require some attention, but even then it doesn't require a lot. So there are many of these mindless tasks. And I'll say, one of the things that people, and they're being sarcastic, fair enough, one of the things that people will bring up is, I can multitask. I can walk and chew gum at the same time. Okay. Chewing is an autonomous task. You don't have to think about it. And so usually is walking. I say usually because there are huge challenges of doing something else while we're engaged in this mindless task. An increasing number of people are getting killed because they're texting while they're walking. And they are not paying attention to their environment, and they walk through a manhole, or they walk out in front of a bus, or any number of things. And the challenge of these autonomous tasks is that they're autonomous until they're not. And there are several things in this category. I would say for many of us, driving is one of these tasks. If nothing's going on, driving is very easy with some fairly small amount of practice. It's when the environment changes that driving gets hard. And the same thing with walking. Normally, walking is very easy. Sometimes it gets very hard and demands our complete attention. The other thing about these mindless tasks, I had a discussion with a client who was saying that he likes to listen to podcasts while he's mowing the grass. And I said, well, great. Are you getting maximum value out of the podcast? He said, well, I'm listening to the whole thing. I said, well, that's not what I mean. Ideally, a podcast, and I certainly hope this podcast gives you actionable things to do. So you're cutting the grass and you're pushing the mower and you're listening to this podcast. And I say, hey, this afternoon, you need to invest in some research along the following lines. And you go, oh, that's a great idea. How do you capture that? My post number one was, your phone is mobile should your calls be mobile. And the point of that podcast was, yes, you can talk on the phone and drive at the same time. But if you get a takeaway, a task from that phone call, then how are you going to record it? And if you're not going to record it, what are the odds that you actually do it? And if you don't do it, what was the value of taking the phone call to begin with? I argue that you'd be better off letting the call go to voicemail, where people will leave you a more complete set of information. And if you have questions, you can call them back. These environments, right? And there's one more that I'll talk about. These environments trick us into thinking we're multitasking. They trick us into thinking that we're doing multiple things at once, when in point of fact, we're either only doing one thing or we wind up engaged in task switching, which we do poorly. I'll say one more category, and this was, I think, fun. As humans, we can learn to combine tasks mentally such that they become one task. I'll give you a couple examples. When I was in college, I spent a few weeks, a few minutes a day, trying to learn how to juggle tennis balls. And it's throwing and catching, simultaneous throwing and catching. And there's a lot to learn there. It's a lot about how to get precise with your throws so that it hits the hand and these where the hand is, right? Make the catch easier. I use tennis balls. A lot of people use bean bags because they're particularly easy to catch. It doesn't matter what their orientation is when you catch them or throw them for that matter. And so what's actually happening is I'm teaching my body to combine two tasks at the same time. If you've ever been challenged to pat your head and rub your stomach, then you can learn to do those two things simultaneously, or at least have both hands moving simultaneously. A lot of people are fascinated by the fact that I can play the bass. And one person said, well, you're doing completely opposite things with your two hands. It's like, well, not as much as you think, because the fretting hand almost always goes with a pluck. Now, great bassists do it differently, but just for general purposes. So that's where the rhythm comes in. And it makes those two seemingly independent things unify into one whole. But we can one whole task. But we can learn to combine things together. I give the exercise of, okay, count to 10, blah. Say the first 10 letters of the alphabet, blah. Okay, now merge the two lists, 1A, 2B, go. And that's to demonstrate this multitasking problem. But you could just as easily learn the sequence 1A, 2B, 3C, 4D. It'd take you, 20 minutes and then 2 minutes of practice every day for a week. And you'd kill that exercise. So that's this notion of we do things, we combine things. One more quick example is this notion of simultaneous chess, where great chess players are playing 10 games at once and they bounce around and make one play on each board in series. And what they're actually doing is they're learning the board very quickly. So they're engaging in this very fast task switching. But it is more error prone than when they're focused on a single game. They do tend to lose more simultaneous games. And they've developed a skill around understanding the positions on a chessboard that most of us simply don't have. And there's lots of detail there about how they remember what's going on the chessboard and all these different ideas. But the point is, in this case, which is really cool, they've really honed the art of task switching, but it's in a very precise environment, in a very structured game. These are the areas in which we believe we're multitasking, but I argue that we're really not. Related to this is the notion that we think we see it, so we're tempted to do it. We look around us and people appear to be doing this stuff. And we look at it and we go, wow, they're walking and chewing gum at the same time. I guess I should be able to do that. Well, in fact, is you can, but sometimes you'll bite your tongue. So we look at this and we see people in the world doing these things. And anymore, my wife often thought in the evenings, if somebody in front of us was driving erratically, that they had maybe overconsumed some beverages. And she no longer thinks that. Now it's, oh, they must be texting. Because we see other people doing stuff and we often fail to recognize that they're doing it poorly. And so we try to emulate them. And so these are these temptations to believe that we can do this thing. And I think that's why we believe it. But this is not good evidence that it doesn't constitute multitasking. Either what we're doing is task switching, practiced task switching, one of these kinds of easily interruptible or mindless tasks, that list that we went through just a minute ago, or there's something else going on. I think that A, that those things don't constitute good evidence, and B, there's no reason why we should try to multitask. There's no reason to believe we can do it. So let's look at some, for example, historical evidence. And I did some research here. The term multitasking was not used before about 1960. And then for the first 20 years, it was all about machines that multitask, computers. And then in the early 90s, this notion, it dipped for a little while. So if you look at, for example, a Google Ngram, where they talk about how often a word is used in the entire body of text that Google is aware of, there's two peaks in multitasking. Well, there's one peak around 1975, and then it dips down pretty dramatically. Then it starts picking up again, and it flattens out at about 2005 at a really high level where we're talking about multitasking. And prior to that, it wasn't even a thing. And so I went and looked at the productivity literature before computing. And it was very different than the productivity literature is now. It's very different. Stephen Covey, even the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which I think of as the kind of bridge idea between former ideas about productivity and modern ideas about productivity, is all about focus. It's all about pick one thing and do it well. It's all about don't get distracted, don't multitask. And then all of a sudden we find that computers can do this thing. And then it seems like, well, if computers can do it, well, humans must be able to do it too. So I'm going to try and do it. But there's no scientific evidence. Now, fair enough, our desire to task switch may be a form of boredom. It may be a form of procrastination. It may just be that we're that scared of low productivity that we wind up in these situations. And sometimes we are forced to split our attention. But those are the times when we get frustrated and worried and frazzled. When we're interrupted and we're forced to, that's when panic sets in. And so, really digging down on why we think we should be doing this. Much of the performance productivity literature prior to 1960 and even now focuses on athletes. And the challenge of being a great athlete is worrying about your form or your technique while you're performing your skill. And almost every sport deals with this. The more physical sports, maybe not as much, but things like swimming. Swimmers can get themselves in a whole lot of trouble time-wise by starting to worry about their form and their physical stroke. Golfers, all you got to do to mess up a golfer is on the first tee, you walk up to him and go, "Hey, I'm curious. Do you inhale or exhale when you hit the ball?" And it gets them thinking about their golf swing. And all of a sudden, their golf swing goes sideways. I think tennis players face this. And they groove their technique very well. And if they start thinking about it and they start thinking about, well, should I grip it more tightly? Should I grip it more loosely? Then all of a sudden, the part of their mind that needs to be focused on their actual performance is not. And much of the coaching is about, let's get the technique down, let's get it to where it's an ingrained habit, so you're less apt to try and think about it while you're doing it. And this is true also for my bass playing. I'm a much better bassist when I don't have to think about what my hands are doing. You get to this point in a skill set where you think about something else. You don't think about your finger placement on the neck of the instrument. You're just thinking about the sounds that you're able to make and the sounds that other people are making along with you. And so all of that to say, prior to about 1960, there was no discussion in the human performance literature really of multitasking, of trying to do two things at once. In fact, it was very much the opposite. And even in work performance, all of the discussion was around focus. All of the discussion, and you still hear a lot of that today. Pick one thing and do it. Eat that frog is pick the one thing you really don't want to do and do it first, so you get it out of the way. But to focus and to only try to do one thing at a time. So where have we gotten here? So we've talked about kinds of things that make us think about multitasking and may lead us to believe that we should do it or try to do it. We talked about computers and how they appear to multitask. And that combined with this notion, this legend with really no scientific basis of our mind as computer. In point of fact, we developed computers specifically to do things that humans aren't good at, which is these repetitive, precise tasks. So, yes, computers appear to multitask, and yes, there's a legend of mind as computer, but the combination of those two things doesn't mean that we humans can multitask. I think another point is that we're not in the habit of valuing our own attention. And the fact that our work now is really our most valuable work is really the work that is best done with heavy focus and heavy attention. Now, while I was talking about this, I didn't even bring up the fact that our attention is constantly under assault in the modern environment. We've talked about it in other places, and that's why I left it out. Our attention is valuable because people can manipulate us by getting us to pay attention to their messages. And I hope you don't think I'm doing that here, but I am trying to teach you, which is manipulating your mental state by giving you information. Or at least, maybe not teach you, but at least make you think about things and question a few things. But we, in general, I think that we undervalue our attention. And fair enough, focus and paying attention to something is difficult. Now, I argue that focus and paying attention to something is difficult because of interruption and distraction. And I think that, well, I've demonstrated that good practices and good tools really make those problems go away. And so not only are we dealing with multitasking here, which I conceive of as a choice of how to do your work, but we also help you with the things that put us in a multitasking situation, which is interruption and distraction. Okay. Computers appear to multitask, humans can't do it. We don't value our own attention as much as we should. There are certain environments in which we operate and are skillful where it seems we're multitasking. And we went through several of those. But I would argue that we're not actually multitasking. And further, I argue that even in those environments, when we're forced to multitask, we get frazzled. And an example of that is if you're in the kitchen cooking and two timers go off at the same time. You have to decide which one you're going to attend to first because you can't deal with both of them at the same time, probably. So these environments fool us into thinking that we could multitask, and then we take this skill that we don't really have but appear to have out of those environments and try to apply it in environments where we're much better off if we really focus. We produce much more value if we really focus. And we talked about a lot of those different environments, and you can review that if you want to. So we think we see it, so we're tempted to do it. We think we can do it in place A, so we try to do it in place B. We think other people are doing it, and we try to do it. But there is no real evidence that we can do it, no scientific evidence that we can do it. So I would argue that we probably shouldn't. Now, if you remain unconvinced, and I'm confident that some of you are unconvinced, I mean, I'm pretty good, but I'm not perfect. Take a look. The next time you go, oh, I think that's multitasking. Think about it. Think about what you were doing. Be a little introspective. And I mean, get done with what you're doing and then look back on it and see if one of the things that you're doing actually fits into one of these categories we've defined here. And in this way, perhaps you'll become convinced that multitasking at best is an emergency measure. And emergency measures should only be deployed once in a great while. And I'm not arguing that there's never a time when we're forced into attending to multiple things at once. I'm just saying that we should avoid it because when we're forced to do it, that we don't do it well. So, as I said, once we can perhaps stop debating multitasking, certainly I think it's a choice of work style. I think that we can not do it if we choose to not do it. And once we can all agree with that, then perhaps we can move on to improving our focus through fighting the enemies of interruption and distraction. And again, that's a lot of what attention compass training is about, but this is a mindset we're trying to deal with here. So I hope that you'll take a look at your own situation and approach it with a certain amount of, for lack of a better word, humility, and go, well, what am I actually doing here? And does this set of actions, is it portable from one environment to another? Of course, as I mentioned before, love to have you contribute to the discussion. I would prefer that happen on LinkedIn, but I suppose some of you are not LinkedIn users, so feel free to comment on the podcast through your player, and would love to hear your insights and thoughts, successful things, unsuccessful things that go on the podcast. Get your feedback. So I look forward to hearing from you. And again, look for me because I'm talking a good bit on LinkedIn and love to have you connect with me. Just dig me up in LinkedIn, Larry Tribble. It's not hard to find me. And shoot me a connection that says, hey, I listen to the podcast, I'd like to connect with you. And then you'll be better able to see what I'm doing there in these questions that I pose, and better able to participate in what I hope is a valuable conversation for you. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.